Welcome to GhostDancer Radio presents the Hours of Power. I accidentally started the stream early. I was not prepared. So we're just going to do what we do best and continue on with the show. Oh, goodness. I can't believe that happened. But anyway, welcome to the show and enjoy. Hit that link if you're interested in plugging your business. Thanks for listening to GhostDancer Radio. Happy Friday, redneck. It's music time for me, buddy. Welcome to the show, Redneck Express. I'm just doing some tunes and marijuana today. You guys are welcome to get on here and plug your businesses or whatever you want to talk about. Thanks for listening to GhostDancer Radio.
Na 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 na. Na 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 na. Na 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 na. I've got to run to keep from hiding, and I'm bound to keep on riding. And I've got one more silver dollar, but I'm not gonna let 'em catch me, no. I'm not gonna let 'em catch the midnight rider. And I don't know the clothes I'm wearing. The road goes on forever, and I've got one more silver dollar, but I'm not gonna let 'em catch me, no. I'm not gonna let 'em catch the midnight rider. Na 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 I'm going back on a kill. Some old bed I'm soon to be sharing, and I've got one more silver dollar, but I'm not gonna let 'em catch me, no. I'm not gonna let 'em catch the midnight rider. No, I'm not gonna let 'em catch me, no. I'm not gonna let 'em catch the midnight rider. No, I'm not gonna let 'em catch me, no. I'm not gonna let 'em catch the midnight rider.
Nope, not gonna do it. Not gonna let them catch me. This one goes out to Redneck Express.
If it keeps on raining, the levee's going to break. If it keeps on raining, the levee's going to break. When the levee breaks, I have no place to stay. Need all the levee, taught me to weep and moan. Lean on the levee, taught me to weep and moan. It's got what it takes to make a mountain man in this home. Crime will help ya, flame will do you no good. No, crime won't help ya, flame will do you no good. When the love breaks, mama, you got to leave. All last night, sat on the levee and moaned. All last night, sat on the levee and moaned. Thinking about my baby and my happy home. Oh.
Welcome to GhostDancer Radio. Shout out to everyone tuned in.
What's up, guys? Just want to give a shout out to Donna for sending Blake and I these two guitars. For under $200, you can't go wrong, and you can get that journey into music and rock started.
Guys, they're pretty awesome. Definitely worth checking out. Sure, it's no Kirk Hammett guitar,
They are good for any pro, any beginner. They do the job. We'll show you what they can do in just a sec. Check out this next video.
Answer to your question, Redneck. Yep, I sure have. Reynolds Peak.
All the time, you have to be in contact with Mother Earth at all times. And when you come out the first time, you cover yourself with dirt. One of the teachings of our people is that of walking on Mother Earth or being on Mother Earth. Nesan Baka'ata is the way that they refer to it in the old traditional teachings. But the teaching is so extensive. The one I could probably begin with is to say that when you've learned ceremonies and you're starting to assemble a medicine bundle, the one thing that was traditionally done was to walk to the top of a mountain to collect mountain soil. That mountain soil was in a small pouch, and it was put into your medicine bundle. Zithdej is what they call it. And the way that you collect the Zithdej, or the mountain soil, after you get to the top of the mountain and you look out over the land area, you take off your moccasins, remove your shoes, and step on Mother Earth with your bare feet. And then you have a small altar that you construct. It's not very big. It could just be a slab of a small rock, or it could be a pile of dirt kind of smoothed out on the top. And on that, you make a stone offering. Is to say that you place on the surface of Mother Earth the sacred stone offerings, and you put down there black jet to symbolize the first world. You put down there a small piece of turquoise to symbolize the second world. For the third world, you put down what they would be called techite, which is actually a piece of abalone. And the last one that you place on there is the yoske, which is the white shell. So you make your stone offering, and then at the same time you offer up your prayer, which is that you would use the corn pollen. Some say you could use the white cornmeal or the yellow cornmeal, but in most cases it's the corn pollen offering. You offer up a prayer. And the purpose of collecting the mountain soil is to have the authority given to you so that you can perform the ceremonies. It is that you now have the authority to conduct the ceremonies that you have learned. So that is how you collect the mountain soil. They say before you leave the mountaintop, after you collected your soil, they say that you put corn pollen inside of each of your moccasin. And then you put your moccasin back on and journey back down to the bottom of the mountain and return home. But during the time that you conduct these ceremonies, there's various times that you have to actually have people take off their shoes. One of those times, of course, is when you have the sand painting. Is that you put your bare feet, on the dry painting. And that's so that you can stand with the holy people, stand in a sacred place with the holy people. Then you sit down. And generally, you keep the bottom of your feet right on the dry painting. While songs are sung and prayers are said, when the ceremony is completed, they take that soil out that was used to make the dry painting, and they take that and dispose of it. That's the way those ceremonies are conducted. Another ceremony is that they take a patient's moccasins or shoes off, and they place inside that corn pollen. But when they do that, you stand and touch your bare feet to the Mother Earth, and prayer and songs and that are sung, and then they place corn pollen inside of your shoes. There are many times they say which means you must remove your shoes at certain times, being in certain places. I remember some of my relatives and that when there would be rain, sometimes there would be a collection of mud. They like to go and they like to stand in that mud and get their feet all muddy. That comes about with the teaching of the two boys that they called the hero twins. To me, I think it's a mistranslation because one is the son of Changing Woman, and the other one is the son of White Shell Woman. Changing Woman's son is Nage Isran. The son of White Shell Woman is Hobachin. So those are the two boys. When they were very small, they were allowed to run around outside of the home barefooted. And during that time, they say that there was an evil giant Yei, which is Yeitso. Yeitso used to eat the children. So when he saw outside of the Hogan, he saw these small tracks all over and around their home. Of course, they had heard him when he was coming from a distance, and so they hid the boys. When he came around, he said, "I see some tracks of small children around here." And so they made up a story. No, we don't have any small children here. We make those little prints with our hands. So we put the side of our fist down, and then we put small print like toes, and so it looks like a little footprint. But we do that because we're lonely. We wish we had children. And so the giant yay, he says, well, it looks to me like you have a lot of little children. And so they make up another story. He says, we would like to have a lot of little children. And so we make a lot of little footprints all over the place. And so he didn't quite believe him, but yet he left them. And so it is that the two boys, when they grew up and they started to kill off all of the things that were destroying the deneh of the earth, and finally they made their journey to their father, which is the one that sees us by sunlight. And so they went to his home. But the other thing is that he made them take off their shoes when they go into a sweat lodge. And he had them go into a sweat lodge and made it super hot to see if they would survive. And so to this day, of course, we can never go into a sweat lodge with our shoes on. We must always take off our shoes. When we take off our shoes, we stand to the east of the sweat lodge, which is where the opening is. And we shout to the east, Tache, really loud. And then we walk to the south, and then we shout in that direction, Tache. And then to the east, we say the same thing. All this as we're barefooted, and we might even be nude as we call out all these ancestors that have passed on to come and join us inside the sweat lodge. And that's what the sweat lodge is called. Tache, which is the Hacheabatato, is where you are at with all of your old grandfathers. You invite them to come into the sweat lodge with you. And the final call to the north, you holler, Hache. And so after you have shouted to invite the grandfathers into the sweat lodge, you go in and you sing 4 songs. All this time, you have to be in contact with Mother Earth at all times. No clothing, you're nude. And when you come out the first time, you cover yourself with dirt. And then you sit around and you dry. And then after that, you go back in again. You sing 4 songs after some hot rock had been put into the sweat lodge. You come out and you cover yourself again with dirt. And then you go in there, you repeat this 4 times. And that is a necessary part of the sweat lodge. They always told me when I was growing up, which meant go back to where you were born. And in that place, cover yourself with dirt all over. And so it was that I would do that every so often to remind myself this is where I would put to the surface of Mother Earth. Which is is what they told me. And so I carry on that tradition as well. I know exactly where I was born. And those are the things that we are told.
Life is not easy at all. There's going to be challenges. You're going to get beat down. That's the way life is.
You sort of put a mask on your face and you go home and lay in your bed when no one's looking at you and you don't have to impress anybody and you're yourself. And fear comes in. Maybe you don't know for sure what's going to be happening in the future and it scares you. Just that fear paralyzes you. And I just want to ask you today, do you think you have hope?
At some point, everything's going to go south on you. Everything's going to go south and you're going to say, this is it. This is how I end. Now you can either accept that or you can get to work. That's all it is. You just begin. You do the math. You solve one problem and you solve the next one. And it doesn't matter how you get knocked down in life, because that's going to happen. All that matters is that you got to get up.
You have to get up.
Whatever experience you're having right now, it has not come to stay. It has come to pass. Sometimes you have to just back up and go within yourself and pray and meditate and recharge your batteries. Go away, clear your head, and then come back and look at it from a different vantage point. Don't operate while you're under the spell or the effect of what's going on. Don't allow your emotions to control you. We are emotional, but you want to begin to discipline your emotion. If you don't discipline and contain your emotions, they will use you. You don't have to force yourself or motivate yourself to think negatively, to be depressed, to beat yourself up over the head, to feel loaded with guilt. You don't have to make any effort to do that. Your mind is on automatic. It will do that by itself. But if you want to begin to move into your own personal greatness, you've got to be willing to go against the tide. You've got to be willing to harness your will and say, in spite of this, I'm in control here. I'm not going to let this get me down. I'm not going to let this destroy me. I'm coming back. You ask for what do you want? Man, I want to be diamond. Tell me something I don't know. Everybody wants it. But the raw reality of it is everybody don't get it. And the crazy thing is, if you want it, you can get it. It's not like somebody is stopping you holding the gun to your head and telling you you can't get it. It's a matter of will. It's a matter of hard work. It's a matter of sacrifice. It's a matter of dedication. It's a matter of commitment.
The difference is not the genetic code, the potential. It's a guy that's willing to get knocked down, finally down, so unfortunately stand back up. The perseverance to see it through. The never say die attitude.
We know the battle ahead. We know the journey ahead is going to get tough. We know we're going to face obstacles. We know it's going to be some discomfort. We know they're going to try to break us. We know they're coming for us. We know that's going to happen already. So let's make up in our mind before the battle that we're going to be victorious. Don't cry to give up. Cry to keep going. Don't cry to quit. You're already in pain. You already hurt. Get a reward from it. At the end of pain is success. You're not going to die because you're feeling a little pain. You tell yourself, I won't give up. When that depression hits you, come out of nowhere. You tell yourself, I won't give up. There's no guarantee that because somebody is now down on their luck, they can never come back. Who can guarantee that you can't make, that you can't have your dream? Who can guarantee that you can't do what you want to do? No one can do that. No one can predict that. You don't know what the possibilities are for your life. Because if you're willing to go through all the battle you got to go through to get to where you want to get, who's got the right to stop you? It's your right to listen to your gut. It ain't nobody's right to say no. That's your own right to be where you want to be and do what you want to do. All we need to do is we look at our dreams as we get ready to hit the floor. I'm blessed and highly favored. I don't care if you're sick. I don't care what you're going through. If you're not dead, he ain't through with you yet. As long as you waking up, you still in the day. As long as you alive, you can still make it happen. As long as there's breath in your nostrils, boo, you still in the game. You still can win. Now get your butt up. She's my leader. She'll only come out at night. Believe in her without. Nothing is new. I've seen it here before. What's she waiting? She's sitting with you, but her eyes are on the door. So many paid to see what you think. Get it for free. The woman is wild. You can't tame by the pearl that you want. Money's a matter. If you're in it for love, you ain't gonna get too far. Oh, here she comes. Watch out, boy, she'll chew you up. Oh, here she comes. She's a man eater. Oh, here she comes. Watch out, boy, she'll chew you up. Oh, here she comes. She's a man eater. I wouldn't if I were you. I know what she can do. She's deadly. She could really rip your world apart. Mind over matter. The beauty is there, but the
She's a man eater.
But I listened to what Jim Valvano said 21 years ago. The most poignant 7 words ever uttered in any speech anywhere. Don't give up. Don't ever give up. Those great people didn't. So I now have a responsibility to also not ever give up. I'm not special. I just listened to what the man said.
But I tell you, there are some times in life where you fall down and you feel like you don't have the strength to get back up. I will try 100 times to get up, and if I fail 100 times, if I fail and I give up, do you think that I'm ever going to get up? No. If I fail, I try again and again and again. For as long as I try, there's always a chance of getting up.
No matter what you might be going through, don't quit. The secret is in not giving up. Everybody who's done something great, they weren't that deep. What they had was resiliency. They had the ability to bounce back. All the great, they didn't quit. No matter how impossible your situation may seem, stay on course. I guarantee you cannot pass it if you quit. I guarantee you're going to fail, but you don't know what's going to happen if you keep going.
I'm fragile. I feel pain. I hurt. I open my eyes. I crave victory. I do not give up. I feel no fear. I fear no man. I create. I conquer. I hold the power.
Make a choice. Just decide what it's going to be, who you're going to be, how you're going to do it. Just decide. And then from that point, the universe is going to get out your way. We can't have another bad year. You've got to get to the point where enough is enough. It's much easier to come up with excuses why you can't do it. If you do what is easy, your life will be hard. If you do what is easy, complain about your situation, your circumstances, surrender and give up on your dreams, become depressed and bitter and angry. Anybody can do that. If you do what is easy, your life will be hard. But if you do what is hard, keep coming back again and again and again. Get up dressed every day. Take life on. Taking life by the collar. You say, yes, I will do it. I can do this. And you've said to yourself, I'm willing to face the nose. I'm willing for people to laugh at me. I'm willing to gut this out. I'm willing to make this happen. It's my time. It's possible. It's necessary. It's hard. It's worth it. I'm going to do whatever it takes. I can do it. If anybody's ever done it at any point in time in history, then what's possible for one, it's possible for me, and I'm going to do it. If you do that over and over again, your life will be easy.
Tomorrow is going to be your first day. If you'd like to work here as a broker. Would you like that, Chris?
Yes, sir.
from the high desert and the great American Southwest. I bid you all good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever in the globe you may be. All those time zones, and each and every one covered like a blanket by this program. Midnight in the desert. And it's going to be a very midnighty program tonight, to be sure. You got any kids in the room, get them out of the room. They don't need to hear this. The rules of this program are simple. No bad language and only one call per show. Unless you're annoying, and then you can't call at all. All right, so I do have a little bit of news for you. Volkswagen. Volkswagen's commercial vehicles and cars from its Spanish unit seats are among the 11 million apparently fitted with a diesel engine that can cheat on emissions tests. This is really, really, really bad news for Volkswagen. The CEO has already received her news. The whole company may be toast. Kind of a shame, huh? Missed the little bug. And then there is this, Edward Snowden, who has confounded, that's an interesting word, confounded U.S. officials since his abrupt departure from the country 2 years ago with a whole bunch of classified stuff, has just found a new megaphone. He has found Twitter, and so he started following the NSA on Twitter. I'm sorry. And he sent out a tweet which just said, "Can you hear me now?" Well, let's see. In about an hour after he said, "Can you hear me now?" 185,000 followers jumped on board. And then 6 hours later, he was up to 625,000 followers, so I guess we can hear him now. Oh, that must have made them really, 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 really angry. That's all I can say. Really angry. Can you imagine? Inside the NSM. Sorry, NSM. Not really. I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing, hopefully, with you, not at you. All right. Now, in news of the other, I've got two, I think, really cool things. One demands an explanation from RCA who follows this program. It is a Mars picture. Now, Richard really needs to look at this. Are you hearing me, Richard? You really need to look at this and tell us what this is. All right? It is taken by the rover from Hillside on September 25th. It's on artbell.com. I suggest you go up there right now. I swear it looks like a creature. It looks a lot like a creature. This is taken from Mars, and it looks like an alien. So, and it's a real picture. It's no BS here. A real picture. Take a look at it. You tell me, our Tom. And then number two, also available at artbell.com. You know, I don't put stuff up there unless it's really good. Did the Pope have some kind of extra audience? Well, something was watching. Something was up there. Something that looks to me like a blob that somebody might have created with Photoshop, but it's not. It's a real picture. It's gigantic. It's mysterious. And it's drifting over the city at distinctly unballoon-like speeds with unplane-like maneuvers. Maybe it was watching the Pope. And, you know, when he was there, that's how somebody caught it with a camera. Or a lot of people caught it, I guess. Okay, let me repeat what I said, and that is if you have children in the room, please get them out. We're going to be discussing global thermonuclear war. I read this yesterday, I'm going to read it again and more of it, about 24 years after the end of the Cold War, Russia and the U.S. seem to be engaged in a nuclear arms race once again that could have disastrous consequences. The United States is announcing it's about to do a $1 trillion upgrade of its nukes. Imagine what you could do with $1 trillion. Now, the Russians are going to modernize their weapons, of course, because it's a new race, right? So they will spend up to $700 billion. Actually, it said 1.3 trillion total earlier on Facebook. It's $1.7 trillion. My God. What's more, Russia deployed nuclear capacity has overtaken that of the U.S., so we are behind for the first time since 2000. Russia has 1,643 nuclear missiles ready to launch. The U.S. has 1,642. Not surprisingly, all of them aimed at Russia. You know, I thought we re-aimed our missiles to the water. So I guess that one's off, huh? Both countries have been upgrading their active nuclear arsenals since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict. Oh, great. The Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation estimates the U.S. has over 7,000 nuclear warheads, compared to more than 8,000 warheads in Russia. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist says the two countries possess 93% of the totality of the global nuclear stockpile. $1.7 trillion. All right, coming up next, Stephen Starr, MT, ASCB, BB, MPH, graduated from the School of Health Professions at the University of Missouri, Columbia in 1985. He subsequently worked as a medical technologist over a period of 27 years at a number of hospitals. He is currently the director of the Clinical Laboratory Science Program at the University of Missouri. Stephen is an associate member of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and has been published by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Mr. Starr is also an expert on the environmental consequences of nuclear war, and in 2011 made an address to the UN General Assembly describing the dangers of nuclear weapons and nuclear war and what it poses to all nations and peoples. He has made presentations to ministry officials, parliamentarians, universities, citizens, and students from all around the world. He specializes in making technical scientific information understandable to all audiences, which will be a good thing for this night because this is a tough subject. I told you, get the kids out of the room. That's the third and last warning. Coming up next, Stephen Starr. I'm Art Bell, and this is Midnight. Part of the Dark Matter Digital Network. This is Midnight in the Desert with your host, Art Bell. Now, here's Art. Here I am. Well, all right. Here comes Stephen Starr. Stephen, I would like to welcome you to Midnight in the Desert. It's going to be a rough one.
Art.
Yep.
It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Good to have you. We have never spoken, right?
Right.
Okay. Stephen, I have been reading, and I just sort of read a little bit of what's been going on. There's so much going on right now that is scary. I lived through the Cold War. I'm 70 years old. I was in the Air Force, Stephen, on the day that we decided if we were going to mix it up with Russia over Cuba, or the Soviet Union at that time over Cuba. And I was working in a hospital at Amarillo Air Force Base in Texas. And I'm the guy who got to go, we were a B-52 base. And I was the guy who got to go over and answer the line that raised the DEFCON level.
Really?
Into the world of really scary. Yes. Yep, I was.
Well, I was doing duck and cover drills at the elementary school in St. Louis County where I lived.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that actually left a big impression on me. It had an effect on, kind of partially led me to where I am today.
I remember seeing that phone ring, and of course I was aware of the ongoing crisis, with Cuba. It was, you couldn't avoid it. It was everywhere. But when that phone went, and boy, you really know it when it goes, my blood just ran cold. I thought, this is it.
Well, it almost was, and frankly, it was a miracle that it wasn't. And again, it's a miracle that there hasn't been a nuclear detonation somewhere, or a nuclear war for that matter, since 1960s. We've had plenty of opportunities for that.
We have, and I guess we've probably been closer than we know, or that the public knows.
We remain closer than the public knows. There's still almost 2,000 launch-ready nuclear-armed ballistic missiles that the U.S. and Russia have that in the course of this conversation could be launched in only less than 2 minutes for them to be launched and to be on their way.
And they would be here how quickly?
If they're launched from a submarine off the coast of the U.S. or off of Russia, then it would take 9 to 10 minutes. Otherwise, from the Montana or the Ural Mountains, it takes about 30 minutes for them to make their flight.
Mm-hmm. The Russians are saying they now have technology that would make it impossible for us to intercept their ICBM should a war begin. Do you believe them?
Well, I don't want to test it.
No.
I think each side, we have our ballistic missile defense system that's being deployed through NATO, and there's a lot of evidence that it may not work as advertised unless you perhaps switch out the kinetic warheads for nuclear warheads, which is something that's not discussed, is considered by Russian war planners. So, but all these things are really they're all being done in the process of ignoring the scientific predictions of the existential threat of nuclear war.
So I take it that if you replace a kinetic weapon with a nuclear warhead, then you only have to be close.
Yes, that's right. The kinetic warheads, they call them hit to kill. These things go about 17,000 miles per hour. So it's like hitting a bullet with a bullet. But if you swap that out for a nuclear detonation, then you expand your kill radius to the point where, it's more like a 1 or 2 kilometers or a mile or so. But I've talked to Dr. Ted Postel, who's written about this. He's at MIT, and he said that there's always a countermeasure available. The warheads have decoys included with them these days, both U.S. and Russian warheads. You could probably spread the decoys out further. Once you get into these sort of arms races, it's almost impossible to stop them. That's why they actually were wise enough to create the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which George W. Bush withdrew from not that long ago.
Well, it also looks like the test ban treaty is about to go up, poor choice of phrase, in smoke any minute now. I guess the Russians are breaking it by testing some cruise missiles and nuclear-armed cruise missiles, and so I guess is it going to go away?
Well, the thing is, there's a political spin that comes out on each side, U.S. and Russian. And, there's technical details about all this that could be argued. But it's sort of like counting how many angels can sit on the head of a pin. We get lost in these arguments about who has the most missiles and who has the most warheads.
Yeah.
In a sense, we treat nuclear weapons as we did conventional weapons, but I think I have a class that I teach at the University of Missouri, and I asked my students about this, like, why do you think we got to the point where we had, something like 70,000 nuclear weapons in 1986. But we have studies that show that 300 strategic warheads, if you detonate those, they'll kill 75% of the people in the United States and Russia. So how could we manage to create, 70,000 50,000 warheads. It really was. They called it MAD, which made more sense than mutual assured destruction. But it was insane. But I think there's a failure to grasp the fact that grasp the essential nature of nuclear war and the existential threat that it poses to human beings.
So actually, you're a professor, Stephen Starr, really, right?
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to teach a class at the University of Missouri on nuclear weapons. It's one of the few classes there are in the United States, which is another problem. You know, after the Soviet Union collapsed, pretty much all nuclear education, what little there was, dropped out of our high schools and even colleges. So the students that come into my class don't even know the difference between an atomic bomb and a hydrogen bomb.
I guess in some ways, Stephen, that's a bad thing, and in some ways, maybe it's a good thing, because if they're ever used en masse, well, I just don't think it's...
Well, maybe I'm naive. Sometimes I feel like Mr. Smith is a Washington kind of guy, but I honestly believe that if ordinary Americans, the non-technical audiences, had any idea that the nuclear arsenal that the U.S. and Russia has represent a self-destruct mechanism for the human race, that they wouldn't tolerate it. But we cannot get the leaders of our countries or any of the nuclear weapon states to publicly acknowledge or discuss this fact. And there's very precise scientific predictions and studies that have been made in the last 7 or 8 years that quantify this, that spell it out about how this would happen.
Well, before we even get deeply into this, we're about to spend $1 trillion here in the U.S. on upgrading our nuclear arsenal.
Mm-hmm.
$1 trillion. $1 trillion. You know how nice our interstates would be if we devoted even a little portion of $1 trillion to the interstates? My God.
That's right. My kids went to an elementary school. It's supposed to be one of the best ones in Columbia. It's supposed to have good public schools in it. It was 100 years old. It didn't have air conditioning. They have to close it when it gets too hot. There's just there's a disconnect between the reality of what we're doing with our public school systems and our infrastructure and our health care, as opposed to the enormous military budgets that go out virtually, unattended every year. This rubber stamp.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, what is the exact extent of the current global nuclear arsenal? And by the way, Professor, you don't have any classified information that you could mistakenly go away here, do you?
Oh, no, it's not necessary to have that. Actually, the transparency is not what it should be. It's the people that provide the numbers that I'll give you are experts and they have contacts, but the government don't really readily give this out anymore. It's getting harder and harder to get very accurate information. But historically, we know that right about now, there's something between 15 and 16,000 intact nuclear weapons in the world in a global nuclear arsenal. And the U.S. and Russia probably have 15 out of the 16,000, let's say. And you mentioned that 93% in your opening, that's about right. So that's why it's so important to focus on the U.S. and Russia, because first of all, the country that comes in next is France with 300. And so there's orders of, it's so many more times greater, numbers that the U.S. and Russia have compared to anybody else. That's where you have to start. Now, if you look at what the weapons are, we each have, U.S. and Russia each have approximately 2,000 nuclear weapons that are deployed for immediate use. So a lot of them are kept in reserve, but 2,000 weapons each would be more than enough to wipe out the human race.
Really?
Yeah, and of these, the U.S. and Russia each have about 1,000 strategic nuclear weapons. They call them launch ready. They're ballistic missiles that are armed with nuclear warheads. They can be launched in 2 to 15 minutes. And once they're launched, they can't be recalled. And as you mentioned earlier, it takes 30 minutes to as little as 9 to 10 minutes for them to reach their targets.
I had heard years ago that by mutual agreement, I was always in real doubt about this, but by mutual agreement, we had both retargeted all of our ICBMs into the water, into the ocean.
Yes, that was kind of a PR ploy that Clinton and Yeltsin had. Clinton repeated it quite a bit during one of his election campaigns. But the reality of nuclear targets is that it takes about 10 seconds to retarget a warhead. All these missiles are hooked up to computers. It was a meaningless agreement. The only way to really change this is to stand down these weapons, make it first so that they can't be launched within a few minutes. And then, but better, let's dismantle them, take the warheads off the missiles. We have to start thinking of this as a problem for our species.
Oh, I do. I think of it as a problem for our species.
Well, the people in charge don't, I think. I think they're so caught up in the moment. The scientists have tried to discuss these studies they're called peer-reviewed studies. They're the best studies that can be done in science. They publish them and they're criticized by all the best scientists in the world. And if they can't find anything wrong with it, then they go into a journal. And these have been out there for 7 or 8 years, and they predict that, even what you would call a successful first strike, let's say that the U.S. launched and destroyed every Russian strategic nuclear weapon, every nuclear weapon that could be launched against the United States.
Right.
Well, the environmental consequences of that successful first strike would cause everybody in the United States to starve to death, along with everybody else in the world. So it's a self-destruct mechanism for the human race. The scientists wrote an article called Self-Assured Destruction, which you would compare that to mutual assured. It's actually all along it's been self-assured.
Right. A little bit. Slow down a little bit. You said even if we had a successful first launch against Russia, that we would starve to death. How does that happen?
Well, the mechanism is that nuclear weapons are really like a piece of the sun when they detonate. And this goes for the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, which was 15,000 tons of TNT explosive equivalent, to average, say, Russian strategic warhead that has 800,000 tons of TNT. That's what's normal today. But both of those when the fireball they create, the surface of that fireball is hotter than the surface of the sun. So what happens then, if that's detonated over the city, it will ignite within a radius. The 15 kiloton weapon sets 3 to 5 square miles on fire, and the 800 kiloton warhead will set 90 to 152 square miles on fire instantly. And what happens is there's fire set over this whole area. It's a mass fire, and within 10 to 15 minutes, it coalesces. They all join together to form a single gigantic fire. In the center of the fire, there's like a chimney effect that rises up, and it creates hurricane-force winds that blow towards the center of the fire. So it'll actually be strong enough to uproot trees and pull into the fire. You can't, and anyone in the fire zone, in a matter of minutes, the air temperature is good above the boiling temperature of water. We first saw a mass fire like this in Dresden and Hamburg and Stuttgart during World War II when the British firebombed the German cities.
Oh, yes.
They weren't even able to go into those cities for quite a few days in tracked vehicles. It was too hot. And even anybody that was in a deep shelter suffocated or baked, basically. It's horrible, but it's true. And so we firebombed Tokyo, for example, with conventional, firebombs like napalm. 100,000 Japanese died in that raid. And then we went on to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we basically crossed the moral threshold for blowing up, burning cities up. But so if you think about what a nuclear war is, if you think of like one 800 kiloton warhead with 150 square miles on fire, then you multiply that times hundreds or thousands, all within an hour space of time. All those fires create enormous amounts of smoke and soot. The scientists have predicted that a U.S.-Russian strategic nuclear war would produce somewhere between 50 and 180 million tons of smoke. And this smoke will quickly rise above cloud level, which means it can't be rained out. And once it gets into the stratosphere, there are high winds. In a matter of 10 to 14 days, that smoke will completely encircle the Earth and engulf the Earth in a global stratospheric smoke layer. And this layer will do two things. It absorbs and blocks the sunlight. By absorbing it, it heats up the stratosphere, which destroys the protective ozone layer. And by blocking that sun, it prevents warming sunlight from reaching the surface of the Earth. And that, in a matter of a week, will produce temperatures colder than they were at the height of the last ice age 18,000 years ago. And the end result is that for 1 to 3 years, the temperatures in central North America and Eurasia will be below freezing every day.
All summer.
Yeah, all year, every single day of the year, and it'll stay cold for so long that will eliminate growing seasons for at least 10 years, maybe 20.
All right. Let's back up just a little bit. You said if both arsenals were used. Let's say we just surprised Russia and decapitated them only, and they didn't have an opportunity really to strike back at us. What have you got then? Do we still have, because you were describing nuclear winter, right?
Yes. And we would still have nuclear winter. There might be, let's just say there's 50 million tons of smoke instead of 180 million.
Right.
It doesn't matter. It's still going to be below freezing every day for at least a year, and there won't be any growing season for at least 10 years.
All right. Hold it right there, Stephen. I'm going to take a break. I told you to get the kid to the room, didn't I? From the high desert, this is midnight in the desert.
Cut or disappear into the potter's ground. When the man comes around.
Taking you from today into tomorrow, this is Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell. To call the show, dial 1-952. Call Art, that's 1-952-225-5278. Don't call yet. Phones are not open yet. My guest is Professor Stephen Starr, and we are discussing nuclear war, global thermonuclear war. And so let's get back to it. Professor, let's go back for a second. I hate to do this, but a little more education on the size of these things. The one dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What was it, little man, big boy?
Let's see. It was Fat Man was Nagasaki, and
that's right.
Little Boy was Hiroshima.
There you go.
And the Hiroshima bomb was estimated. There's different estimates, but let's just say 15,000 tons of TNT explosive equivalent. They have to compare it to something, so they compare it to TNT. But a nuclear detonation is really different, fundamentally different than a high explosive chemical detonation, for a couple of reasons. The stellar temperatures it produces, literally a couple 100 million degrees centigrade at the instant of detonation at the center of the fireball.
So in other words, that's actually not then a completely accurate description of the power of the weapon at all.
Right. There's an article on my website by Professor Lynn Eden called City on Fire. She points out that actually the U.S. military has significantly underestimated the destructive capabilities of their own nuclear weapons, because they don't really consider thermal effects or the effects of fire, which I was describing earlier.
Yeah.
But you asked about the explosive power. So it's 15,000 tons of TNT. And when that's detonated, it will ignite fires simultaneously over an area of about 3 to 5 square miles. And that's opposed to the modern, they call them strategic nuclear weapons. These are the weapons that are possessed by the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states. But the smallest, I hate to use the word small, but the smallest yield of or explosive power of a strategic weapon is 100,000 tons of TNT. And U.S. ICBMs usually have somewhere between 300,000 tons of TNT to 475,000 tons of TNT. The Russian ones are generally a little bit bigger. They're about 800,000 tons of TNT. Our bombers, our nuclear bombers can carry a nuclear gravity bomb, the B-83, that has 1.3 million tons of TNT explosive power.
What, excuse me?
Yeah. Well, they call those megatons. The kilotons means 1,000 tons, so 15 kilotons, Hiroshima. After hydrogen bombs were invented in the early 1950s, it wasn't all that long before American bombers were carrying multi-megaton weapons around. That was, you probably remember, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the average warhead size, is usually 2 or 3 million tons of TNT. China still has, I think their warheads are believed to be about 3 million tons of TNT explosive power. They don't have a lot of missiles that can hit the U.S., but they have some. And they're just like every other nuclear weapon state, they're modernizing their arsenals. So,
just a little bit of trivia, if there is such thing in the subject. I believe that we accidentally dropped 2 nuclear weapons on North Carolina.
mm-hmm. Yes, there was an accident, a B-52.
Yes.
What the end result was, they back then they carried these multi-megaton gravity bombs,
right.
And a couple of them got loose and went down. They have what they call permissive action links. They're basically a safety device that are built into each weapon, at least the United States has,
right.
And they have to be triggered sequentially in order for the bomb to go off. There's usually like a series of, say, 6 or 7. And on one of the bombs, there was only one left. All the others have been triggered. So we would have had probably, we would have had millions of tons of explosive power going off there. The fallout would have gone all the way to New York City. It probably would have killed most of the people in North Carolina, I would guess.
One more 5-volt little signal, and it would have been as you described.
Right. And, there's other accidents that we don't know about.
Well, before we leave that one, what I heard was that they retrieved one of those weapons,
mm-hmm.
and one of them they didn't.
There actually is one that is in the ocean off the coast, and I don't really find that very reassuring.
No.
If you know about World War I, they're still digging up artillery shells that they're corroded on the outside, but they're fine on the inside.
Right.
So I don't know, but I mean, there are nuclear bombs scattered around the bottom of the ocean. There have been some that have fallen off aircraft carriers off the coast of Japan that rolled off the deck. It's a hell of a mess, really.
Yes. All right. So we have hydrogen bombs now, and these are the ones, for example, like the B-83, right? That would be a hydrogen bomb with
mm-hmm.
yields up to, 1.3 million tons?
Yes. The design of nuclear weapons, so the first, the difference between the atomic bomb, then they came up with a hydrogen bomb, and the first hydrogen bombs were enormous, and they stayed that way for a long time. In the 1980s and 90s, they actually started making them smaller in explosive power, but this was primarily because they were able to put them on the top of ballistic missiles, and they came up with multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, so you can put, say, 10 warheads on one missile.
Right.
And they're generally, the strategic weapons now range in the hundreds of thousands of tons of TNT explosive power, but some are over 1 million. And I really have, I have no doubt that both the United States and Russia still have some multi-megaton weapons that they keep somewhere in case they need them. We still have 4,000 or 5,000 weapons that they call them scheduled for dismantlement. So they actually don't go into the totals of the United States and, as far as how many weapons we have. They'll announce that we have 1,000 weapons, but then they don't mention that there's 4,000 that are still basically in the same condition they were a few years ago and maybe in the same place. So they schedule them for dismantlement. So I call it disarmament by semantics.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, multiple warheads are just a way of doing more with less, sort of.
If you want to get into the calculations, if you set off a number of smaller warheads over an area, you actually create more blast damage and just as big a thermal effects as one big warhead. Military planners tend to focus on blast, mm-hmm. which is because they want to, and so that's why a city like New York or Washington, D.C. would be a good example. They might target it with, say, 40 warheads, where actually one of these 800 kiloton warheads would be more than enough to set the whole city and way beyond into the suburbs on fire.
100 and some odd miles, right?
It's they calculate these firestorms based on average weather conditions, but even under the very worst weather conditions for 800 kiloton warhead, you're going to have about 90 square miles where you're going to have a certain fire zone. Mm-hmm. But on average weather conditions, it's more like about 150 square miles, and it can be more than that on an exceptionally clear day. So on my website, I focus on fire because as we mentioned earlier, it's the fire is what creates the smoke, and the smoke gets up into the stratosphere and can block the sunlight and create these ice age weather conditions on Earth that eliminate the ability to grow food crops for years.
Assuming a full exchange, how long would a nuclear winter?
Well, there's actually new studies that are being done. I keep in touch with my friends, the scientists, and it looks like it could be 20 years even, but I mean, the global grain reserves right now are maybe enough for a couple of months. But you mentioned, I think at some point, India and Pakistan. Well, they have a big nuclear arms race going on there now. But what they produce initially, at least, are atomic bomb-sized weapons. They have about 200 operational atomic bombs, 15 kiloton or 15,000 ton size. So the scientists did a study on a war with 100 of those being detonated in their cities.
Right.
And they found, they predicted about 5 million tons of smoke would get into the stratosphere. It would be enough to block about 10% of the sunlight from reaching the surface of the Earth for at least 3 or 4 years, maybe 7. And the smoke would stay up there for longer than 10. This would cause enough of a decrease in crop production that it would, it's predicted that up to 2 billion people would starve to death just from an India-Pakistan.
Actually, India and Pakistan have been right up to the brink any number of times.
Right, yes, that's true. And they're not getting along all that well right now, from what I read.
Well, it seems, Professor, we once lived in a world where MAD was, sort of the operational mutual assured destruction stopped everything from happening. Now, I wonder if nuclear war might be possible on a smaller scale. I know this is what they toy with, these ideas they toy with, these games, as it were, war games. Is it possible? Is a smaller nuclear exchange survivable?
Well, it's not survivable if you happen to be in the target area.
No, of course not. Of course not.
But I would say that any war is possible. The fact that we have launch-ready nuclear weapons that can be launched even in the course of this conversation, it's been like that for years, so there's sort of a false sense of security. What worries me these days, a couple things. Here in the United States, I'm worried because there seems to be a general lack of knowledge and understanding about the consequences of nuclear war. And there's also appears to me to be an idea that we can just threaten the Russians and they'll back down. So what happens if they don't, or our militaries come into direct contact? As far as India and Pakistan, they're right on each other's border. If they launch a nuclear weapon, a ballistic missile, it'll detonate in a matter of a minute or two or less, So they don't even have really early warning systems like we've constructed these early warning systems because since we're on the opposite sides of the planet, it gives us enough time to detect the launch and then pass the warning up to the president. And then he can decide whether he wants to launch a retaliatory strike based just on early warning system data. And if that's wrong, then he's actually launching a preemptive nuclear strike. But all of these things, and I've written about this. I just did an article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists today about launching before or after the detonation of a nuclear weapon, based on early warning systems. But the problem is that we're talking, when we get into those sorts of discussions, we're avoiding the real issue that's never discussed, and that's the environmental consequences of nuclear war. That has never been discussed by any of the nuclear weapon states in a public way, and it's avoided.
Well, I want to give the preppers a small reason to continue to prep. It's a small reason.
Sure.
Relatively, now, if there was an exchange between India and Pakistan, things would be bad. But if you're prepared, survivable, I take it, in North America.
Well, if you want to look at a scenario like that, and historically famine has been caused not just by lack of food, but also by scarcity, rising prices and the inability to purchase, and then the restriction of exports.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if there was a war in India and Pakistan where nuclear weapons were detonated and this global stratospheric smoke layer was produced, and it was quite clear that like for example, you wouldn't be able to grow wheat in Canada for a few years. then the exporting countries that grow grain would probably say, okay, that's it. We're not sending anything overseas. We got to keep this for ourselves. So all the populations that are dependent on imported foods, especially grains, are going to just be SOL. So that's first of all, there's about 1 billion people right now that live on the edge of starvation. And Dr. Ira Helfand from Physicians for Social Responsibility, I'm actually a senior scientist with them too. He wrote a couple of papers that shows that, if you reduce the caloric intake of somebody who's already starving by just even 10 or 15% over the course of a year, they're going to starve to death.
Right.
And we're looking at 10 to 20% reductions for sure in the rice and the corn crops in China and the United States, and even worse further north. So, I think, if you're a prepper, it kind of depends what you're preparing for.
Well,
I don't think there's anything wrong. I'm into self-sufficiency myself. I live out on a small farm. I have apple trees. I have a photovoltaic electric system.
Right.
But I like that, and I think it makes sense if people need to do that in general these days.
I'm with you all the way. I've got solar panels. I've got generators, on and on and on. Anyway, again, I want to come back to this scenario, and I know you don't like any scenario that involves nuclear weapons. Nobody would, but
sure.
This particular one, India and Pakistan, let's say they really let it loose. Somebody in North America, let's say in Ohio, I don't know, what effects would that person in Ohio have to live with over any number of months or years?
Well, I can give you some pretty good answers to that. The scientists that did these studies, they compared it to, there was a volcanic eruption, the largest one in the last 500 years, called Mount Tambora.
Oh, Tambora.
Yeah, and the summer that followed that eruption was called, it was called the Year Without Summer.
Mm-hmm.
That was actually when they wrote the novel Frankenstein. They were killing in North America. They were killing frost every month of the year in June, July, and August in New England, and there was famine in England, in Europe. There wasn't much of a density of population in the United States, and there was enough wildlife and everything. I think there was famine here, but what we would, so they predict that the cold that would follow the sort of war that you're describing between India and Pakistan would actually be twice as cold. It would be colder than it's been in the last 1,000 years, would be the average surface temperatures. And that's quite cold.
So, wait a minute. I'm in Ohio. How am I doing?
Well, you're gonna have a really severe winter. As far as food, well, who knows? In the United States, a lot of things have changed during the last 10 or 20 or 30 years, and we're really dependent on, different types of imports that would have been sort of a joke if we thought about it, in the 1970s and 60s.
Right.
I don't know. Our whole infrastructure is very fragile in terms of there's a couple days worth of food, maybe a week's worth at the most in our grocery stores.
That's true.
If something breaks down under those circumstances, then we're going to be in trouble. I don't know. I think it's going to be below freezing every day here. It's not going to be that cold. It's not going to be literally like colder than Ice Age weather, but it's going to be damn cold, and I suspect food's going to be scarce. And, but when you get into a situation with nuclear war and global famine, I think that just totally destabilizes the international relations, and who knows what that would lead to. So when you try to make predictions on that, it's kind of
that's another conversation. But I mean, if I'm in Ohio and I'm a prepper, I probably would survive the effects of that. Or
I would, as long as it doesn't lead to a larger nuclear war. But you might want to have a fair amount of food on hand, like the Mennonites or the Amish, and keep a year's worth of food. It's not a bad idea.
What about the radiation, Professor?
Well, radiation is something that, it's funny because I don't talk about it quite so much because once you can kill everybody with the climatic consequences with, cold where you can't grow food. But radiation is a big, that's sort of, it's almost, you could do a whole show on that. It depends on what gets targeted in a nuclear war. Our nuclear power plants now, We have over 100 in the United States, and on site they store about 5 to 10 sets of used fuel rods that they've been removed over the course.
Yes.
And these, they call them fuel pools. They're like swimming pools where they keep. They have to be kept underwater because of the intense radioactivity, which also produces a lot of heat that has to be removed.
Not so friendly if they get out of the water, right?
Right.
All right, Professor, hold tight right there. We'll come back to my Ohio example, if we can, in a moment. I think scientists like this really actually don't like to discuss the possibility of something, what's the right word, that could be survived. I'm Mark Duff.
Coming to you at the speed of light in the darkness. This is Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell. Now, here's Art.
Professor Stevens is my guest, and here I come again, Professor. I'm in Ohio, and Pakistan decides to decapitate the other side, and so they get into a full-fledged war. I'm going to probably be able to survive if I'm prepper, if I've got food. It's going to get cold, and I know that people who speak, people like you who speak in front of whoever it would be, don't even like to talk about nuclear exchanges that would be survivable because you don't want them at all, right?
Well, there's a lot of truth in that.
Yes.
Part of it is because, I have a habit of trying not to make predictions that, it's a scientific approach where you don't say what you can't prove. But,
Right.
I think your description of what the post-war scenario is like is accurate. And, I think it would be a nightmare. It would be really cold, and this would be for a year. It would be like 10 years without summer almost. It'd be colder than it's been in the last 1,000 years. And
now this is only India and Pakistan, right?
Right. And that 100 atomic bombs that were detonated in that war have about, maybe even less than 1% of the explosive power of the weapons that the United States and Russia have.
I know.
Ready to launch, and it only takes 2 to 15 minutes.
Well, we once, Professor, lived in an era where MAD was operational. It was just suicide to even consider it. But now we've got countries like North Korea. North Korea is interesting because they probably are suicidal, or at least the leadership may well be suicidal. And so we can't depend on good old MAD so much anymore.
Right. Well, it wouldn't be a mutual assured destruction in their case because they have like 10 atomic bombs or so. But,
at the moment.
Yeah, but all these arsenals are getting bigger. Even India and Pakistan, at some point are going to start producing, thermonuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons instead of just atomic bombs. So, there's got to be a point where people, well, actually there is a point. There's a thing called the Austrian Pledge. There was a meeting in Austria, and 113 nations have signed this a request. They're trying to get a conference together, but they're calling for the banning of nuclear weapons in the same way that chemical and biological weapons would be banned. And then the ban, after a ban, of course, there'd be an elimination. Guess what? Guess who's against that? The 5 nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
It's, oh, no, this is, we don't need that. This is disruptive of our process, and we want to stick with the non-proliferation treaty. Because that's doing just fine. But, it's been 50 years since that was signed, and it doesn't take, a rocket scientist to see that the nuclear weapon states are busy modernizing their arsenals. Just as you mentioned, $1 trillion to build, we're rebuilding our entire nuclear weapons manufacturing complex in the United States is what's going to happen. In Kansas City here in Missouri, they just are finishing this gigantic hundred millions of dollars going into a facility that builds all the non-nuclear components, but that's about 80% of the bomb. And it was the biggest construction project in Missouri. And I thought, there's really something wrong with our society when that's the best, when our biggest project is to build a new nuclear weapons plant.
Back to Pakistan for a moment.
Right.
India and Pakistan. Assuming they had a full exchange, little me in Ohio. Radiation. We didn't really get there.
I sort of I started talking about nuclear power plants in the U.S. and maybe I really wasn't answering your question there. As far as the radiation from that exchange, I think there would be a lot of it. If you detonate a weapon on the surface as opposed to into the air, you get like a really nasty fallout. But what happens there is those sorts of the fallout from that rained out and spread more regionally than globally.
Okay.
You have to have about 100 kiloton weapon for the fireball to go above the troposphere, or where the weather takes place, up into the stratosphere, where it's above cloud level and it can't get rained out. That's where the term fallout came from. We had all these big, in South Pacific, we detonated all those hydrogen bombs, and they were enormous. The largest one was 15 million tons of TNT.
Wow.
And so those fireballs went into the stratosphere, and it only takes about 2 weeks for the wind to blow it all over the planet. When you have a nuclear detonation, you create literally hundreds of different types of radioactive isotopes or elements. But most of them have very short, they self-destruct in a very short matter of time. They call it a half-life. But there's some that don't. And those, particularly, it's strontium-90, and that gets into your bones and your teeth. And cesium-137 that gets into your organ systems and tissues. Those have 30-year half-lives. And then, of course, there's uranium and plutonium. When you detonate, most of the bombs have plutonium pits, and even the very most efficient bomb doesn't have all the plutonium fission. It's a lot of it's blasted into microparticles.
Is there any such thing as a clean bomb?
No, not they all produce, and there's no such thing as a clean nuclear fission. Anytime you split an atom, you produce a lot of radioactive byproducts. And most of these, like the cesium-137 and strontium-90, haven't really existed during the entire time complex life has evolved and developed. And so it's new to us. And that's one of the things I think that's been ignored or almost suppressed. And they focus a lot on external doses of radiation. But very equally or even more important is if this stuff gets into the biosphere, these long-lived radioisotopes like cesium-137, and it gets into your foodstuffs, and then you eat it, and you ingest it or inhale it.
Right.
It can have it causes other diseases besides radiation, besides leukemia and cancer. I spent a year helping to translate a study that was done in Belarus that was done after the Chernobyl nuclear power plant blew up.
Oh, yes.
And about 25% of Belarus was seriously contaminated. And the most predominant radioisotope is cesium-137. And it gets into everything. Like even the wood, when they burn firewood for heating and cooking, it turns their chimneys into like small nuclear reactors, but the children there are really sick. Only less than 10% of the children in these contaminated areas are considered to be healthy. And the study that I got translated was done over a 9-year period. They examined 100,000 children, and they did thousands of human tissue samples done from autopsies of children and infants in these areas. And they found that the cesium concentrates in the endocrine tissues as well as the heart, the pancreas, the spleen. And this led to all sorts of problems like heart attack, stroke, hypertension. They call it Chernobyl heart. Is something that these kids have that if they don't have an operation, they die. And so this, but this, after the scientist made this presentation, he went home and he presented to the parliament in Belarus. He went home. The police came and kicked his door in. They arrested him. They went to his medical institute and destroyed all his archived slides and samples from 9 years worth of research, and they put him in a prison camp for 6 years. So this information hasn't been made public. I presented it at the New York Academy of Medicine about a little over a year ago, and if you go to the EPA website and you look at cesium-137, they say it's uniformly distributed in the body. Well, it's not true. But, again, the nuclear industry has so much influence and power that they dispute all of this, of course. And they say the sort of doses that these children are exposed to pose no threat to human health. So there's a real fundamental argument going on here. But these are the health physicists that are trained by the nuclear industry. They have their own safety standards they develop. And these health physicists actually aren't doctors. They have no really training in medicine. But they dispute what the scientists and doctors are saying.
I see. Well, the recent nuclear accident in Japan, yes, I believe there was some 137 distributed to some fairly wide degree.
Right. That was what my presentation at the New York Academy of Medicine was about, was the massive contamination of Japan with cesium-137.
What are going to be the effects down the line of that?
Well, the nuclear industry will tell you none. They'll say, oh, there's no big deal. And, they still have an area that's an exclusion zone. But they say, well, we're opening that up. They're trying to make it, scrape off enough dirt so people can drive into these cities that they wash the roofs off on and pretend like it's safe. But I don't think we know. That's the worst thing about all this, all the atmospheric weapons tests. We detonated 100 atomic bombs in the deserts of New Mexico. And I honestly think that's the largest environmental disaster in American history. They kept all the fallout secret from people. They didn't even know what was happening. But so all of the combination of that has raised the amounts of ionizing radiation to much higher than, there really wasn't background levels until we started detonating nuclear weapons. And we don't know what the long-term genetic consequences of this stuff is.
Okay.
And I think that it could lead to all sorts of genetic diseases that, maybe are just starting to appear now.
Sure. I get computer messages as we do the program. Mark asks, could you please ask about the effects and even explain, if you can, a neutron bomb, a neutron weapon?
Sure. Well, it's designed, neutrons are atomic particles that are found in the nucleus of the atom. And when atoms break apart or fission in a nuclear chain reaction, neutrons are, sprayed out. So they have a weapon that's designed to sort of minimize the blast and maximize the radiation effects of neutrons. So it kills the people, but it doesn't destroy as much of the property as it would otherwise. But it's, it's certainly it's a weapon of mass destruction, yes. A genocide, really.
Well, I guess in a war that would be a big potential goal, wouldn't it? I mean, you want to destroy your enemy, but you want the physical assets possible.
Yeah, traditionally that's what war is all about. You want to conquer the other country and take advantage of their wealth and their people. But that's the problem with nuclear war. Besides the fact that we'll all starve to death afterwards, the contamination and destruction for these weapons goes, beyond time and space. We're talking, it transcends. It'll last for centuries or millennia, and they really are. They're not precise weapons. If you look at the weapons that NATO has, for example, you were mentioning those in your introduction. I think
yes.
The B-61 bomb that the U.S. it's actually a new nuclear weapon that we're creating. It has they call it dial yield, a variable yield, where it goes from 300 tons or 0.3 kilotons of TNT up to 50,000 tons. There's different mods or models. There's some that actually go up to 170,000 tons.
Wow.
So, but these weapons, they're guided weapons, so they can be used very precisely, but it makes them more what they would call usable. And so therefore, it makes it more likely that they will be. There's this whole psyche of, well, we have to have a credible threat. And in order to make our threat believable, we have to have weapons that it looks like we would use them. But, we're backing ourselves into a corner today. What do you have to use them? Then you actually start a nuclear war. And if you're fighting with somebody that has nuclear weapons like Russia, they have plenty of, weapons like that, battlefield weapons, they call them, or tactical. And they respond in kind. And all the war games that were ever done with NATO, for example, during the Cold War, once they crossed, they called it the nuclear fire break. Once they went from using conventional high explosive weapons to nuclear, it was only a matter of time before it escalated into just a complete nuclear war, a holocaust. So I wonder if our leaders know that.
Yes, how quickly do you feel that threshold would be? Let's just have an example here. Let's say that Putin decides that he wants what they had, the old Soviet Union, and they begin moving into state after state after state, attempting to reform what they had. Now, to some degree, NATO, I guess, would at some point step in, but boy, oh boy, when you start talking about it in real what they had. Now, to some degree, NATO, I guess, would at some point step in, but boy, oh boy, when you start talking about it in real life, understanding what would happen if we stepped in, we would be probably really cautious. And I don't know how many countries would fall before we decided we would step in. And once we did, even a small exchange, artillery, for example, they have nuclear weapons that can be fired by artillery, right?
Well, the Russians do. We did. I'm not sure if we still have those or not, but we certainly have plenty of what we would call tactical nuclear weapons. You don't even have to go to a situation where you're imagining that Russia would invade. The U.S. has moved something like 700 tanks. We're in the process of moving like enough to arm a mechanized division to the Poland and the Baltic states.
That's right.
And what if Russia was doing that to the United States? What if they were moving a mechanized division to Mexico? How do we react? Putin's under a lot of pressure to react to these sorts of things. Mm-hmm. If you remember their Victory Day parade that they had, the 70th anniversary of them defeating the Nazis in World War II, and the Western leaders and Obama decided not to go to Moscow, right? But at the same time, what was going on was in Estonia, NATO was having a war game with something like 15,000 troops and planes and tanks from 9 member states, which is 150 miles away from Russia's second largest city, St. Petersburg, which was called Leningrad in World War II, where they had 800,000 people die when the Nazis surrounded it. The Russians had 27 million people that died in World War II. We had 414,000 or something like that. So it's a big deal. When you start doing stuff on their border, I worry that when we pile up these forces, even in the Cold War, American forces were the closest they were to Russia were in West Germany. They were never on the Russian border. So we're actually in a more dangerous situation now than we were then, in my opinion.
Well, I thought too. I think the same. In a way, it's much more dangerous than it was then. Right. And then you throw in all these other unknowns, like the Koreas. I'm not so sure about what's going to happen in the Middle East, but probably nothing good. So it could begin in all kinds of places. Let's go to Korea, because they seem, right now anyway, the craziest. That leader over there, that little guy, is likely to decide that, okay, suicide it is. And so we launch. And I'm sure the first to go would be Seoul. Seoul is so close to the border.
There's a lot of scenarios there. I've read some different scenarios where I think North Korea has so much artillery that's in range of Seoul that they could actually almost destroy the city without a nuclear weapon. And they could reserve their nuclear weapons for the harbors, for example, to prevent troops from coming in.
Good point.
There's a lot of, but I don't. The thing that differs about when you talk about North Korea, it would be a nightmare. There might be as many people killed in that as there might be 10 or 20 or 50 million people killed in a nuclear war with that. But it's still, I don't think you have to have the 100 detonations that we talked about in India and Pakistan before you create this global smoke layer. Mm-hmm. So there is sort of a threshold for the whole nuclear winter process, but it hasn't really been defined as such.
Professor, what do we know about North Korea's bombs? We have monitored any number of, and I've heard mixed things, like it was a partial dud, or in other words, what do we think we know about where they are?
Well, any country that develops nuclear weapons begins by developing what we sort of like we did with an atomic bomb, a relatively simple bomb. If you have highly enriched uranium, then you can slam two pieces together. That's the very simplest one. We didn't even test that before we dropped the first one in Hiroshima because we knew it would work. If you make it from plutonium, which is what the North Koreans have done because they had a reactor and they irradiate the fuel rods, they produce the plutonium that way, they extract it. Then it's harder to make an atomic bomb from plutonium because because of the nature of plutonium, you have to implode it. So that was an invention in the Manhattan Project. They actually had to create concentrically placed explosive charges on the exterior. They had something the size of, say, a grapefruit that they made into the size of a walnut by exploding everything on the outside, and then that creates fission. So that's why the North Koreans have to test their weapons to make sure they work.
Do they work?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Do they work?
Well, they do work, although there's the first ones, if they don't produce a whole 15 kiloton detonation, maybe they produce 1 or 2 kilotons, and they call that a fizzle. But 1,000 tons of TNT going off in a city is certainly, with radioactivity, is not anything that would be a minor problem. But they don't. I think that it's quite clear that they have, the equivalent of atomic bombs now. None of both India, Pakistan, and North Korea, they all still have the sort of the atomic bomb type weapons. They haven't gotten to the hydrogen bomb or the thermonuclear weapons that have the 100 kiloton or megaton yields. But they may. I mean, it's just a matter of time, and that's one of the things we have to come to grips with.
Moreover, they are developing launch vehicles that are starting to be effective.
So, I don't know. I've never tried to offer like political solutions for a lot of problems. My goal has been to explain
what would happen,
existential threat that these weapons pose, and hope that's enough of a motivation factor to try to lead to some constructive.
Okay, solutions. Professor, we just had a big brouhaha about Iran. Now, do you have any knowledge about how close Iran is? I mean, the Israelis say one thing, we perhaps say another, Iran says another. I wonder how close they really are to a nuclear weapon.
Well, when you talk about building a nuclear weapon, there's a number of things that people don't usually appreciate. When you enrich uranium, which means that you're increasing the concentration of the isotope U-235, that's only about 0.7% normal in the normal existing uranium. When you get up to 20% enrichment, you actually can create, it's called weapons usable. You can make a weapon from that, but it's so big you couldn't make it into a bomb or put it on a missile. It's not what they call deliverable. So the process of weaponization, of getting higher enrichments, is how you move to make, a weapon or a warhead that you could put on a missile. I think that the impression I got is that Iran was fairly close to getting like a 20% enrichment on a lot of their uranium, but I don't, after that, it's just you read one report or another, like you said, you don't really know.
I heard they might have 1,000 centrifuges going, something like that.
Yes, well, they create a cascade of centrifuges in order to separate uranium-235 from 238. It's the same element, so you can't use a chemical process. So they make it into a gas, uranium hexafluoride, and then they spin the gas in a centrifuge. And so over time, the heavier isotope will sink further towards the bottom, and the lighter will rise to the top. And then they actually send this through a series of thousands of centrifuges. So by the time it gets towards the last ones, it's actually getting enough of an enrichment or a concentration of the U-235 that it can be extracted. So there are other ways to do it, but that's in the way that I think that Iran has approached it.
I have interviewed any number of theoretical physicists like Dr. Michio Kaku. I'm sure you've heard that name.
Oh, sure.
And I asked him at one point what he thought our chances were, as a human race, of not destroying ourselves with these weapons. And he said less than 1%.
Yeah. Well, I hope he's wrong.
I do too.
I think if we keep going the way we are, then, I might have to, say he's right. But my belief.
Well, that's it. See, things are not getting better. They're getting worse. They're getting more dangerous. That's what I see.
Well, what's amazed me, and my biggest frustration, and if your listeners want to, something I'd suggest that they try to accomplish. We can't get the leaders of the nuclear weapon states. We can't get Obama to meet with these scientists. He can't get his advisors to meet with the scientists to discuss their studies. That they just want to say, hey, look, we've done this remarkable research with state of the art computers, and it's been evaluated all around the world by the world's best scientists. And this is what's going to happen if you have a nuclear war. Somebody has to have enough guts to get out on the world stage. I think it has to be one of the leaders of the nuclear weapon states and say, look, we're having all these problems getting along and everything, but what we have to talk about, what we have to understand is if we have a nuclear war, we're going to kill not only everybody in our nations, but everybody else on the planet. And, the other nations around the world are actually coming to grips with this, and that's why you can have an Austrian pledge with 113 nations calling for banning nuclear weapons. But, the nuclear weapon states are resisting this, and so you're like, that's what really troubles me is that, here in my own country, we can't even get a hearing, and these guys are the best scientists in the world. They're not doing this on the back of an envelope. They're doing it in their National Center for Atmospheric Research and University of Colorado Boulder, Rutgers. It's not. They aren't amateurs.
Professor Kaku was invited to work on nuclear weapons and declined. And I wonder how. Surely some of the people have worked on nuclear weapons. And I wonder how they can rationalize that in their minds, knowing what they're doing.
Well, you're right. I think there is a rationalization. I can't really speak for anybody else. I was a nuclear engineer when I first went into school, but I sort of had a process of realization where I thought, I don't want to do that. It was a long time ago, admittedly, back in the 70s, where they were pretty much stopping building reactors, and it looked like, regardless, I looked at the problems of nuclear waste and the nuclear weapons, and it just didn't feel right. So I went into biological sciences, but, I have some friends, like you said, I've got a good friend, Greg Mello, out in New Mexico. They have a Los Alamos study group.
Yes.
And he, he talks to a lot of the people that work there, and, weapons designers. And, so, and these aren't like, I don't know. I don't consider them evil, bad people, but I do think that where do somebody has to say this is enough. Somebody has to come to grips with the fact that, we just can't keep doing this.
Well, have you ever actually spoken to one of these men about the morality of what they're doing?
Well, some of the people I have spoken to, there was a former commander of a Strategic Air Command, Lee Butler, and there's a few other military guys that I've met with that have all rejected nuclear weapons and nuclear war. And, some of them do it because they just say, well, there's no military utility in it. We can't use these weapons, because if we do, so just from that sort of pragmatic military viewpoint, they and the concern that they have is that the younger generations now are sort of becoming accustomed to them. They're not really. And when you think about it, too,
Professor, we're at a break point. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And when we come back, I want to talk about our atmosphere and our magnetic field. Should we have a full exchange of nuclear weapons. I'm Art Bell.
I can see her lying back in her satin dress, in a room where you do what you don't confess. Someday I can feel it coming in the air tonight. Oh, Lord, I've been waiting for this moment for all my life. Oh, Lord.
Want to take a ride? From the high desert and the great American Southwest, this is Midnight in the Desert, exclusively on the Dark Matter Digital Network. To call the show, dial 1-952. Call Art. That's 1-952-225-5278.
Not yet. Not yet. My guest is Professor Stephen Starr. And a lot of people are asking, why would I do this show? And my answer is because nobody else will. I'm telling you, we have forgotten what little we knew about the effects of nuclear war, or perhaps never knew at all. So, Professor, welcome back. I was going to sort of jump ahead to if we do have a full exchange with Russia, something I consider really possible, unfortunately, either getting started by effects, but what do the models say would happen to, to our atmosphere and the magnetic field that protects us anyway?
Well, there's the models that I've been referring to primarily focus on what would happen as a result of the nuclear firestorms, that producing tens of billions of tons of smoke that rise above cloud level into the stratosphere, blocks sunlight, and it blocks 70% of the sunlight in the northern hemisphere for 10 years. So if you were standing in a field in Ohio, you were talking about Ohio earlier, and it was midday, if it was a little bit of a cloudy day, it would be about like standing outside at midnight on a full moon. That's how dark it would be.
Wow.
So that's why it would be below freezing every day for 1 to 3 years. I thought you were going to ask about electromagnetic pulse.
I'll get to it.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure. I don't know what the predictions are for the electromagnetic layer. The studies that I've looked at don't really consider that. But, the presentation I made at the New York Academy of Medicine this year, I did talk about what would happen if we had the grid down for a long time and we had enough EMP from weapons that would cause all the nuclear power plants to melt down in the United States. So that could be something we might want to talk about.
Yes, well, let's back into that. I'm well familiar with EMP at a small level. I'm a ham operator. I've got 13 towers up on my property.
Oh, man.
I know that when a storm comes over, I definitely feel the effects of EMP when I get close to strikes. However, this is a whole different matter. Now, in order to disable North America, let's say, how many nuclear weapons detonated way up there would it take?
Well, it really wouldn't take very many. I think that's part of the reason why they worry about nations getting any nuclear weapons. If you have a relatively high yield weapon, it can knock out tens of thousands of square miles worth of anything with a transistor in it would melt down basically the control panels of nuclear power plants.
How high, Professor?
Pardon me?
How high?
I think that they would detonate those several hundred miles high. They have, I'm sure they figured all this out. The Russians actually tested. We did a few tests ourselves before they had the atmospheric test ban treaty. They said they detonated one over the Pacific and knocked out the power in Honolulu. There was a study that was done about electromagnetic pulse, congressional study, and I got a copy of it, but I don't know if they had a classified version or not, but I was really very disappointed to see that they didn't address what would happen in nuclear power plants. And so what I did talk, Arnie Gunderson, I bet he's like really he's a nuclear engineer that really knows his stuff.
Yes, sir.
I talked to him about it. He said that, one high altitude nuclear detonation over the east coast of the United States could knock out like 60 nuclear power plants. And what would happen was that the reactors would melt down, and then also the spent fuel pools that I'd mentioned earlier, that have 5 to 10 times more radioactivity, long-lived radioactivity than the cores do, they would boil off. Once the cooling stops, the water heats up and will boil. And when it gets down to the point where the rods are exposed to steam or air, then those rods will rupture, and if they've been removed recently enough from the reactor core, they'll burn.
Right.
And that would release an enormous amount of radioactivity. Just one, nuclear power plants produce a lot more of the long-lived isotopes than nuclear detonations do. For example, one nuclear spent fuel pool has more cesium-137 in it than all the atmospheric weapons tests combined released, over 1,000 tests. And so, and we have 100 of those pools scattered around the United States. When I did my studies on this, I was looking at there's an exclusion map around the destroyed Chernobyl power plant. There's about 1,100 square miles, what they call it, a radioactive exclusion zone where people aren't allowed to live. Mm-hmm. And when I was looking at the map one day, I realized that the key for that map was based on how much cesium-137 was in the soil. And they described that in terms of becquerels, and I'm not going to give, but what it amounted to was that less than about 1.2 grams of cesium-137 contain enough radioactivity to make a square mile uninhabitable for a couple centuries. An American dime weighs, just 2 or 3 grams. I think it's 2.7 grams. So less than half the weight of a dime of cesium-137. If you make it into an aerosol or a smoke and spread it over a square mile, you can't live there for 100 years.
My God.
And so the average spent fuel pool in the United States has close to 2,000 pounds of cesium-137 in each pool. So, and see, cesium is it's a very volatile element. It's almost like mercury. So around 700 degrees, it actually turns into a gas. And, these rods are hot. The reason they're so radioactive, the radioactivity creates heat. And if they lose the cooling and they're exposed to air, once they get up to about 700 degrees, the cesium inside the rod becomes a gas and starts to expand. It causes the rod to rupture. And that's why, like at Fukushima, for example, so much cesium was released, because when all those fuel rods, the reactors melted down, it released all the cesium. It went up into the air, and the winds blew it around, and then it rained out. So
So you're telling me it would take only one large bomb over the East Coast, mm-hmm. and all our plants would melt down. And
there'd be 50 or 60 plants that could melt down just from one bomb.
Might be academic, because at that point we would consider that to be an act of war, and we would be in a nuclear conflict almost instantly, wouldn't we?
I guess so. There's I assume that with a weapon like that, they could track it.
Oh yes.
But there's just as an aside too, I'd like to point out to your listeners that a huge solar flare, like the one they had in 1849, I think it was a Carrington
event. Yeah.
If we had anything similar to that today, it would destroy all the really large transformers around the United States that support the grid. And the grid would be down for 6 months to, maybe a couple of years.
Sure.
So that's another issue with all these spent fuel pools. It's not nuclear war, but, it's something that we ought to worry about. So that's another reason why I'm not really a big fan of nuclear power. I see that in my opinion, they need to, that's something that we need to address immediately. We have to get the spent fuel out of these swimming pools and into at least interim storage.
They want to move it a few miles from me if they can.
I think they should put it in the basement of the White House,
Yeah, well.
Okay, well, maybe some people might resent that, but, it's always out of sight, out of mind. And there is a place, for example, in Finland, it's called Onkalo, where they're building So the only real scientific approach to nuclear waste storage is about 7 miles deep. It's going to take them over a century to build it. It's enough to store their waste from 4 or 5 nuclear reactors. It's a movie called Into Eternity that your listeners might want to watch on YouTube. And that's what's really amazing about that is it gets you start to think about how long the stuff has to be isolated from the biosphere. We're talking like a million years, so that's, I don't think we should make any industrial toxins that last that long, that are that toxic at an atomic or molecular level. So, if you have an accident at a wind tower, for wind energy, it might kill a couple of towers if the turbine, a couple of cows if the tower falls over, but we don't have to worry about evacuating the entire state.
Well, I understand you're not really commenting on politics, but hasn't Fukushima essentially done the job for you and stopped it?
You mean
new plants?
Well, I think what's happened is that nuclear power is just it's not economical. It's even gas-fired plants that they're building are more efficient. They make more money basically. So these older plants, they're starting to shut them down. I think the industry is dying. They keep trying to come up with new designs to convince everybody that it's
safe. Safe. Are you there, Professor? I think you just lost him.
I'm sorry. That was my fault. Can you hear me now?
You are there. Okay. Let me use the opportunity to throw a question at you that has come in on the computer as well. Charles says, how many nuclear weapons are there in outer space?
Well, if there are any, nobody admits to it.
Uh-huh.
But that's a problem. We're moving towards an arms race in space, and but I think, as far as I know, nobody's got stations out there with weapons mounted on them.
Well, there sure would be a good reason to have them up there.
They used to talk about, we actually planned to put them on the moon at one point. That was a long time ago, but
well, the moon, that would be too much warning. But I mean, my guess, if they're sitting up there on satellites, now you're talking about, I don't know that there'd be any warning at all, would there?
Well, that's a good question. What I could tell you about they call it depressed trajectories. If they fire from a submarine launched ballistic missile off the coast, you can use a trajectory that's like not typical, like it goes up and this way up and comes down. Then you can shorten the flight time and make it really hard to detect.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem. We have the system. They call it, the article I wrote that was published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists today was about the dangers of launch on warning.
Mm-hmm.
And once the U.S. and Russia constructed these early warning systems on each side, and we basically kind of hooked them up to their national command authority, the president, and then the ICBMs that we have in our silos, the buried underground. They got crews sitting there 24/7 waiting for a launch order.
We have to launch on warning, don't we?
Well, I don't think so.
But in reality.
Well, what if it's a false warning? What if it's a false warning of attack?
Oh, well, that would be an accident.
Yeah, that would be, then our retaliatory strike would actually be a preemptive nuclear strike.
My point is that with the effect of these weapons, you have to launch on warning. Once you have made up your mind, the other side has launched, it's use them or lose them, right?
Yeah, but that gets back to the military mindset of essentially thinking about these almost like we did with conventional weapons and ignoring the scientific consequences of their use, to the environment. Because if somebody launches a large nuclear strike, we're cooked. It does, and so if we retaliate, we'll make it worse. But that's the reason why we're advocating that first of all we stand these weapons down so that you can't launch them before, or at the very least you would not launch a strike before a nuclear detonation confirms that the strike has occurred.
Professor, it would be too late. Let me for a moment make you the president, mm-hmm. which I know you don't want to be. But you now have your military coming to you, President Starr, and saying they've launched. The other side has launched. Your orders, Mr. President.
Well, I would say that if I had not been president long enough to arrange for the weapons to be stood down, I would say we will not launch unless there's confirmation of the attack, because there's been more than one occasion where there have been false warnings of attack. They rolled the lids back off the silos. That happened in 1985, even when they had a faulty computer chip at NORAD. And it signaled that a massive Soviet strike was underway, when in fact it was just a 50-cent computer chip that had gone bad.
Mm-hmm.
But see, they stopped, I wrote about this some years ago, but they stopped publicizing this information. But we do know that in 1995, for example, the Russians sent a letter to say, it was Norway, and they sent a letter to Russia and said, we're gonna have a launch of a missile. It's a weather satellite. Well, they didn't get it, and so when this missile was launched, it appeared to the Russians that it was from a submarine launched ballistic missile.
Right.
And they went to full alert. They had their nuclear briefcases open, and they were ready to launch a retaliatory strike, because there's some scenarios that involve a single weapon using EMP, say over Moscow, that would disable their communication systems. So it was plausible to them that even though it was one missile, it could be a prelude to a nuclear attack. But again, we're not told about all the false alerts and things that they have. We're just reassured that, don't worry, we're in control and everything's fine.
All right, Professor, I am curious. This sort of clampdown in the media, ever since the Cold War has ended, I mean, there was plenty during the Cold War, but since, with it now being even more dangerous, and there's so little education of the kind that we're doing tonight actually out there, what's up with that?
Well, I do appreciate the fact that you're willing to have me on your show and discuss the subject, because it's really important. And the reason I teach a course at the university is because I thought, well, where do you start? If we have an uninformed public, then eventually the leaders that we elect are uninformed too. And that's what I see. There was Global Zero was interviewing a number of the people on the Armed Forces Committee, and none of them knew how many nuclear weapons the United States had.
At some point, the unthinkable will eventually become thinkable.
Yeah, when was the last time people even observed a nuclear weapon detonating? I'm not saying we should have one so they could watch, but I'm not convinced that people fully understand. You can look at the numbers and all this, but do they really know? And there's another issue that's never discussed that I think we should mention, is that how does the ability of the president to launch a nuclear attack, how does that mix with our whole idea of limitation of powers and, the War Resolution Act of 1973, where the president's not supposed to be able to declare war? I've got a quote from Vice President Dick Cheney in 2008, and he said, "The president of the U.S. is now, for 50 years, is followed at all times, 24 hours a day, by a military aid football that contains the nuclear codes that he would use and be authorized to use in the event of a nuclear attack on the U.S. He could launch a kind of devastating attack the world's never seen. He doesn't have to check with anybody. He doesn't have to call Congress. He doesn't have to check with the courts." That's the truth, and it's that's the way it is. So that, to me, what that means is we have a small, one person, or at least a very small group of political and military leaders that have the ability to launch a nuclear war that we have nothing to say about.
So even for an object that would end the world, we use a sports analogy.
Yeah, right. That's right. And the Russians have the same thing. They call it shagat. Both, no matter where Obama goes or Putin goes, there's somebody in the background with a suitcase that allows them to give the permission order to launch a nuclear strike. And it only takes 30 seconds to give that order. And they call Minutemen missiles that for a reason, because it only takes 2 or 3 minutes for them to launch.
All right, Professor. Hang tight. And we will begin to open the lines, and I'll give you that stuff as we get back. You're listening to Midnight in the Desert.
Let the phone ring until answered. These calls are unscreened for your listening pleasure. Call 1-952-CALL-ART. That's 1-952-225-5278.
Well, all right, let me roll through it. There's some new stuff in the call-in show world, and we'll get the public number for you to call if you would like to speak or have a question for Professor Starr. Public number is area code 952-225-5278. That's 952-225-5278. Then we're going to do something a little different, if I can find it. We're going to initiate, we did this last night, in the last hour of the show, and I want to do it again. I want to open a first-time caller line. If you have never called, got a new number for you. Only if you've never called the show. Area code 775-285-5800. Once again, 775-285-5800. Only if you have never called the show. And then, of course, as you know, you can reach us on Skype as well, North America at MITD51, and the rest of the world at MITD55. But before we get to the phones, and they're coming up shortly, Professor, welcome back. A good question would be, if the Earth did endure a full exchange between the U.S. and Russia, how long might it take, or would it ever recover and be habitable again? And if so, how long?
Well, I think from what I can understand myself, what would happen it would be like a mass extinction event, similar to when the best example is when meteorites hit the Earth, and that was when the dinosaurs were wiped out about 66 billion years ago. They know that an asteroid, a metallic asteroid about 6 miles in diameter, hit the Yucatan Peninsula, and when it hit, it threw up enough heated material into that when it came down, it actually heated the upper atmosphere to 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, created temperatures at surface level about 600 degrees, 700 degrees. It set all the forests of the world on fire. It was, they call it impact winter. It was so dark that you could have held your hand in front of your face and you wouldn't have seen it. So that's worse than what a nuclear war would do in terms of the atmospheric effects. But the result was that like 70% of all the species on Earth got wiped out, and no animals larger than probably a squirrel lived. So, we're looking at something that's analogous to that. And I think the sad thing is the people that are in charge need to understand that they can't go live in a shelter underground for 10 or 20 years and expect to come out. If you're in an environment where there's very few, if any, animals left and forests have been destroyed, that's not really habitable when you're at the top of the food chain. So I think that's why I think we have to look at this we have to somehow come to grips with this as a species problem, and we have to think of nuclear war as a mass extinction event, as opposed to, we talk about destroying civilization and all. Well, those sorts of catastrophes are almost incomprehensible, but yet they're still survivable. But extinction is quite permanent by definition.
It is, yes.
And that's why I think that's why I resent when we get feedback from the White House saying, we went, I didn't, but some of the people in a group I work with, PSR, went and talked to John Holdren, Obama's advisor, shortly after Obama was first elected. And they were told that, well, we think that if the prompt effects of nuclear war don't prevent war from happening, then the long-term effects aren't really that important. Well, they certainly are important. For example, if you live in a country that's not involved in the war, it's not even in the target area, but all your people are going to starve to death as a result.
Yeah, it was going to actually be my next question. You recall the movie On the Beach, right? Of course.
Yes, actually, I spoke in Melbourne.
Really?
On Hiroshima Day, and that they, you know, they had me. Somebody came up and talked to me about that.
Yeah, so I always wondered, was it realistic in that the Southern Hemisphere would not be extinguished immediately? However, the eventual effects would get them, and essentially that movie was within the realm of accurate.
That movie focused on radioactivity, basically.
Right. That's right.
And you know, if we have a war where they bomb all the nuclear power plants and put immense amounts of this long-lived radioactive, ionizing radiation into the atmosphere, and God only knows what that. I mean, that to me is almost unthinkable. But what we're talking about really with the studies that we talk about with the smoke and the blocking the light and the cold, that there would be a lesser degree of light being blocked in the southern hemisphere, but they predict like 35 to 40%. But still, there's going to be such a global cooling effect that for all practical purposes, it won't matter. It might not be quite as dark and not quite as cold, but you still won't be able to grow any food. And, I asked one of the scientists about this, and there may be some people at the equator that might survive. But I have an article in the Federation of American Scientists that's going to be published this month called Nuclear War, Nuclear Winter, and Human Extinction. And the point I try to make is that I don't think it's worth getting into an academic debate about whether or not all the people would be killed, but just the fact that there's a good chance that they would be, to me, is enough. That should be a fairly powerful, enough of a motivation to at least publicly acknowledge and discuss this. The nuclear weapon states won't do it. They won't. None of their leaders will come out and talk about any of this stuff. They just want to talk about the deterrent, and nuclear war deters. But in order to have deterrence, all sides have to remain rational. They have to fear death. That doesn't seem like it's going to be the case forever.
That is our modern problem. We have ISIS, which, by the way, is in the midst of trying to get hold of a nuclear weapon. Mm-hmm. We have North Korea. They both seem like very, by our standards, completely irrational groups that want to bring on Armageddon.
Right. And, I think the real issue I see is that everything is wired. So, when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis that you mentioned earlier, we didn't have launch-ready nuclear weapons at that time and all these things hooked up that we could launch, 2,000 strategic warheads in a matter of, less than 15 minutes. But we do now, and things can happen so fast. You put these forces in Europe on Russia's border, and a jet plane can overfly, and a missile can go off, and things can happen quickly. And, both the U.S. and Russia have operated on what they call a counterforce military doctrine for decades. And what that does is it tasks the military to destroy the other side. In the event of war, the military's mission is to destroy the other side's nuclear forces before they can be used to destroy you. So once war starts, all the calculations change. Then you get into the fog of war, and then what happens? Too fast. Everything's hooked up. So what the last thing you need to do is to keep, pounding our chests and threatening, and but I don't see any simple way around it except by just getting, let's cut to the chase. Get some leader to come out and say, look, if we have a war, we're all going to die, and we really need to talk about this, and explain it in a way so that
that's the rational approach, and it would work with rational nations.
Mm-hmm.
But not
right. Well, I'm referring. My concern is with the U.S. and Russian strategic arsenals, because they've got 15 out of the 16,000 weapons on the planet, and it might. Who knows? I admit a lot of people say, yeah, right. Wishful thinking, but I don't know any other way to approach this. I don't have a political solution to every problem. I don't think it's. You have to get above that. You have to have some kind of like trump card. And to me, this is it. It's like, well, if we have a war, everybody dies. Mutual assured destruction is really self-assured destruction. even with our successful first strike, we're going to die. So what do we do about it?
I don't know. I guess the only winning way is not to play.
Right.
Remember that line? I think it was good evening, Professor Plotkin. Hello. A strange game. The only winning move is not to play.
I remember that. Is that War Games with you, right?
That's right. That's correct. Yes. Let's very quickly, Omaha, Nebraska. By the way, you'd be first to go there in Omaha.
Thank you very much. I think you're probably right. That kind of leads into my comment that you're both referring to. 15, 20 years ago, we had a governor, Frank Morrison, who was our governor at the time of the missile crisis. And I had the opportunity to visit with him basically on his deathbed. And we talked and visited about a lot of things. I asked him what's some of the most noteworthy or some scary things that happened that you recall as a governor. And he related that he came within 1 day of completely quarantining the state during that missile crisis.
Really?
And anyway, it's documented. I mean, I've seen.
What would the purpose of quarantine have been in that case?
Well, basically because of all the testing that was done in Nevada and the airstream that was carrying all the fallout this way. And anyway, that was kind of.
Oh, I see. You're talking back the above ground testing days here in Nevada. Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, and I know there's been tests of the effects in the state of cancer-related things because of that. So anyway, that was just one comment to make. The other thing I wanted to ask your guest, by the way, this is a phenomenal interview tonight. I thank you, Art, and your guest. But he's from the University of Missouri, correct?
Yes, sir. Uh-huh.
Anyway, I'm curious if you know of a Nebraska that used to teach down there by the name of John Neihart. He was in the English department. He's noted for the book Blackout Speak.
Well, I know exactly who you're talking about. I never had the privilege of meeting him, but I've actually listened to some recorded lectures.
Yeah, he was recorded division of Blackout, and but those are two of the most peace-loving, peace-seeking men that I knew. And this with the Supreme Chair of the Earth and stuff. But just one last thing.
Yes.
I think the Pope's comments recently could be, he made reference in one of the talks often to, we need to enter into conversation.
Yeah, we need to enter into a conversation. All right. Again,
I think that's a good point about the Pope. If the Vatican and the Pope, they can get behind nuclear disarmament, it helps when you get sort of dialogue going. And, another thing that is not made the news big time, but at the International Red Cross has come out strongly in favor of banning and eliminating nuclear weapons. The Red Cross hasn't joined in because of political pressure, but
really,
they certainly, International has come on record for it.
I'll be darned. Back to something we discussed sort of a little while ago. If I were to ask you to guess, just a guess, Professor, about whether there are nuclear weapons in space, what would your guess have to be?
I don't think there are, although I would say that, I have no way to know that they're not. I think that they don't really have to keep them in space because they have so many ready to go here on Earth that they can hit any target they want on Earth, at least at the very most an hour, and most of the time 30 minutes or less.
Usually, if we can do something, we do it, and I'll leave it.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason when they talk about moving nuclear weapons to Europe, this is all a political thing. It's although it's dangerous because if you forward-based nuclear weapons, say in NATO countries, then you make them, in a sense, not only easier to use, but they're also more at risk for terrorism and threat. It's a bad idea. And you can still hit any target you want with a U.S. Trident sub can carry up to 200 warheads, that are independently targetable. Under the START treaty, they supposedly carry less, but just one sub has enough warheads to take out every major city in Russia, or whatever. And they also outfitted some of these subs to carry conventional warheads. So, or cruise missiles.
Okay.
And
let me try this.
There's not a need to put weapons in space.
Let me try this. If the Russians had a nuclear weapon in space, would we know that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what our national technical capability is, but I'm sure they monitor. Each side always monitors their launches and stuff. The Russians in the 1990s, it was a mess over there, and they at this point they have lost almost most of their early warning system capability from satellites, just ground based. So they're putting it back up, I believe, but I don't know. The U.S., even though the military moans and groans about, not having enough funds and everything, we've constantly modernized our arsenal, and these weapons are, if they were that dangerous or unsafe, we certainly, they are. I don't see how a nuclear weapon can be considered safe in the first place. But in terms of military thinking, when they complain about a weapon being unreliable, what they're talking about is not whether or not it will date, but they're worried about the explosive power being within a few percent of what they want it to be, because that goes into their calculations for blasts and all that.
Okay, Sergio on Skype, you're on the air.
Yes. Good evening, Art.
I'm not hearing you very well. You're going to have to get very close to the microphone of whatever you're talking to.
Yes, good evening. Is that better?
Better.
Yes, good evening. Great subject. Long time listener to you. Very interesting subject tonight. I just want to ask your guest, is it true that both Russia and the United States both have the what Russia's called a dead end, which is the automatic retaliatory system? In case no one is alive, it will retaliate automatically.
Good question. Very good question.
Yes. It's interesting. I knew one of the guys. His name was Colonel Valery Yerinich. I wrote an article with him and worked together with him. He actually helped design that. It went into operation around 1985, and Valery passed away a couple of years ago, but he had told me that as far as he knew, it was still in operation. It's called Perimeter, or the Dead Hand is the nickname. It's called the Dead Hand, which, as your caller suggests, it's designed in the event that there's a decapitating first strike. There's a surprise attack that kills everybody in Moscow and prevents them from issuing a launch order. There's a command module that's about 60 miles away from Moscow that there's a couple of guys, they're officers that sit there. And Colonel Yerinich wrote about this in his book. He said there's a couple criteria that has to be done. There has to be an early warning from the National Command Authority that an attack is imminent. Then there has to be a complete loss of communication. And they have a lot of redundant. They have radio, they have satellite, they have fiber optic, all sorts of. They've never ever, he told me, in the history of their strategic rocket forces, lost communication with this. But so they would lose communication, and then almost simultaneously they would have nuclear detonation detectors that are optic and seismic and radiological. And if all these criteria are met in a very precise time frame that corresponds with the warning of attack, then they launch. They're called emergency communication rockets. These rockets, after they take off, they broadcast a signal that overrides all human interference. It just automatically launches any surviving nuclear forces.
Gee, good thing nothing can go wrong with that.
Yeah. Well, I never found it very reassuring. From a military standpoint, they said, well, this is good because it prevents us from launching on warning on just electronic signals if it's a false warning of attack. Mm-hmm. But, I always wondered what would happen if something went wrong with one of the rockets. Just the fact that means there has to be radio signals or frequencies that can be broadcast that can launch nuclear weapons. That I don't find that reassuring.
Nor do I. On my first-time caller line, you are on the air.
Hi, good evening. Art, this is Howard in Virginia. How are you?
I'm fine, Howard. Thank you.
KI4LWA, and I've listened to you for over 10 years. And the reason I know is I just renewed my ham radio license. So I entirely blame my joy in the hobby on you, because you always spoke of it, and that's what got me in the hobby. So
Thank you.
Quick question that you can answer when you second is if you're where you hang out on HF if you do these days. I'd love to make contact sometime.
Well, if 10 meters ever comes back, I'll be there. Do you have a question for my guest?
Yes, sir, I do. Hey, good evening, Stephen. Love the conversation. It's one of those that's just so deep it's hard to know where to start swimming. But I guess what came to I got a quick comment, a question and a comment. My question, Stephen, is with all the I just think the Middle East is still probably the place this stuff might happen, but with the portable suitcase nukes, different things like that. If you think there's ever been a detonation that we haven't heard about, the tactical news, all that stuff is probably over in that theater. And how many of those you think are out there rolling around and possibly could go off? And then my hope is, Art, for the world is that maybe if we can last a few more years, that the particle beam weapons, and that's what I think might be in space, honestly, like that video of the space shuttle when that thing shot up and So I'm hoping that our technology will make these things obsolete someday. But that's it. Thanks so much. I love your show, and I'm glad you're back.
Thank you very much. All right. So do you think there's ever been a detonation? Kind of a hard question that we've not detected.
Well, there was what came to mind and was when it's believed Africa had developed nuclear weapons.
Oh, yes.
And they tested them over, I guess, in the Atlantic with the help of Israel. And, the only way to detect something like that was with a satellite, and because people aren't going to see that. I guess your guest may be referring more to a detonation that took place that there would be visible destruction.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting pretty cynical about almost all the news and things that we hear now, because I honestly think we get so much propaganda that's rather than facts. And a lot of the facts are being omitted. But, there's a lot of technical capability out there to register radioactivity. And that even goes along with, say, trying to clandestinely manufacture nuclear weapons. It's amazing what you can detect in the atmosphere of radionuclides if somebody's sensitive equipment. So I've always thought that, there's enough, even though a lot of these scientists are linked to the government might tell them don't release any information. There's still people that have equipment that I honestly think if there was a nuclear detonation, you would be able to detect it from atmospheric radiation as well as the site. That enormous explosion they just had in Tianjin in China.
Right.
That was like between 5 and 10 kilotons from what I can see with this blast calculation.
Really?
Enormous. I don't think it was nuclear because I think there would have been enough fallout from that you can't hide that. There's always, if you produce ionizing radiation, nuclear detonation, you can't hide it.
Okay, suitcase nukes.
Well, the suitcase nukes,
they're real?
I've studied that. They did exist. They were manufactured. But when you miniaturize a nuclear weapon to that extent, it's actually a very technical process. It's nothing at all like putting together an atomic bomb. But, the first atomic bomb was just basically a can barrel with two highly enriched pieces of uranium, but they fired one through the barrel and the other. But when you try to miniaturize a nuclear weapon, it's very complex. And the experts that I've read about said over time they degrade. And it would be the first reports I read about that were in the late 90s. I think it was Alexander Lebed. It was a Russian guy that announced this. And but even if it was true that they weren't able to keep track of them, my opinion is if anybody really got their hands on one of those, they probably would have used it. I think if a terrorist organization or somebody gets a nuclear weapon, they're not going to just sit around and say, well, let's wait till a really good time. They're going to shoot that thing off.
How many do you think were made?
I think the Russians said that they'd made something like 90 or 100. Lebed said that they could only find 50 or 60 of them. So, who the hell knows? But, there's a lot of things that are even, to me, are scarier. The Soviets had nuclear material scattered all over the place. In Kazakhstan, they were working on nuclear rocket engines. And they had enough uranium and plutonium down there to make 60 atomic bombs. Mm-hmm. And the United States went in and got a lot of that out with the help. That was back when we were actually kind of working with the Russians, but it's really, I swear to God, it's just amazing that we haven't had a bomb go off somewhere. It really is. There's so much highly enriched uranium that's out there that's been manufactured that, it's really a miracle that we haven't had it put together and used in a bomb someplace.
Okay, down to Houston, Texas, first time caller. Hi.
Hey, good evening, Art. I can't believe I'm online, actually. I just have a question.
Are you listening, sir? I've got a question. Are you listening online?
Yes, sir, definitely.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, yes, sir. My question, sir, actually, I read an article a couple of months back. It was, I believe they asked a Russian defense minister. It was just a basic scenario that the Russians said they would drop a nuclear weapon into, I believe it was Yellowstone National Park, since it is an active volcano, and that would basically just disrupt the United States, break it in half. I don't know if that's a scenario that.
Well, it would be, if they did that, it would be an act of war, and then we would have global thermonuclear war, right, Professor?
Yeah, that's true. I read that same report, and I even discussed it with a friend of mine who had done studies on it.
Yeah.
He said that the effect that they're predicting is somewhat debatable, talking about dropping weapons off the coast of California. There's what scared me about that is just that there's military guys on each side. We have, extremists in all the nations, and the Russians have ultra-nationalists they'd like to start a war right now. We have people like that in the U.S. too, but, I worry that, Putin may be pictured as like a really bad guy, but there's honestly a lot worse. We can wind up with somebody a lot worse than him if we're not careful, so.
This is true. All right, let's see. I think it's Felton, California, is that correct?
Yeah, hi, this is Tom in Santa Cruz.
Yes, Tom.
I wanted to ask Professor Starr, are you familiar with a book by John Mueller, who happens to be my cousin, called Atomic Obsession?
I'm sorry, I'm not, but I'd like to read it.
Okay, yeah, he's a professor of politics at Ohio State University. He argues, or at least he tries to reassure us, that the states so far and the future ones, such as maybe Iran, who may be getting nuclear weapons, will soon find out that, like the military people you mentioned earlier, that there's really nothing you can really accomplish with them if you actually use them. So they're
unless you're dedicated. I guess he's not hearing me. Unless you're dedicated to the destruction of a nation like Israel, unless you're actually dedicated to doing that, and then there would be something you could do with them, right?
Let me say that there was a general in India that made a comment about, they said, well, which nation got invaded? Was it North Korea or Iraq? So there is a perception out there that having nuclear weapons, if you're, a small nation, might provide you with a means to escape invasion. In a sense, it's sort of like a six-shooter in the Old West. And that's why Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, William Perry published some articles in the New York Times a number of years ago, actually called for the abolition of nuclear weapons because their perception was that the United States was so far ahead with its conventional weapons that nobody ever be able, the small nations can't even think about catching up. But the way they can kind of equalize the situation is to build some atomic bombs.
Well, it's a great way to get foreign aid.
The mouse that roared.
The mouse that roared, indeed. But it actually is a great way to get foreign aid.
Yeah.
Would we really be looking at North Korea the way we do and providing food and other things for
them?
That's a
good point.
If they didn't have nuclear weapons? I think the answer to that is a very, very, very clear no way. So, yeah, that's a reason to try and get them. Hold on, Professor. We're at the bottom of the hour. Take a deep breath. In fact, everybody, take a deep breath. And we'll be back. This is Midnight in the Desert, possibly for humanity. deGrasse Tyson, which I find kind of intriguing. We're going to have Neil on in the not very distant future. That's right, Neil deGrasse Tyson. So that's one. Now, if I could just talk to Ed Snowden. Let me go way off reservation here and ask you, Professor. You followed, I'm sure, the story of Edward Snowden, yes?
Yes.
The country seems more or less evenly split on what he did. How do you feel about it?
Well, I think that he's somebody that should be considered a hero. You know, that he was trying to expose clearly corrupt things that were going on in the government.
Unconstitutional things.
Yeah, if people remember what the Constitution is.
Barely. Barely,
But,
and that, that's what tonight's show is all about.
Systematically destroyed,
yeah.
Unfortunately.
People don't remember the Constitution. They don't remember what really could happen, with these weapons. And that's why we're doing what we're doing tonight.
Right. Well, the Constitution was designed to protect the people from the government. And so we seem to have lost that protection.
You seem to have. Let's go to Colorado Springs, I think. Hello.
Yes, thank you, Art, for doing this show tonight. This is Kevin in Colorado Springs. I guess the ultimate question I have is, what can be done to stop this?
Boy, that is, you're right about that. It is the ultimate question. Professor?
Well, maybe my solution is too simplistic. On an individual level, I would recommend people to first consider joining, look around and join an organization you feel comfortable with. I like the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. You can join Physicians for Social Responsibility. You don't have to be a physician or a healthcare professional. There's International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICANN. A lot of really young people are really into that organization. That's a good start because you need to be a little bit educated on this.
I don't think your solution is too simplistic. I just think that, I'm sorry to say, but it's dated.
Right. Well, you have to do more than just write letters and join organizations. That's the first step. But I think it's time for, what gets attention these days? You have to do something. You have to, so there used to be protests and even those, but when we had 1 million people in Washington, D.C. in 1982, but that was back when we had more of an educated public. I'm not sure if we have time to educate the whole public about this, but it's my hope that at least pressure can be brought upon the leadership I consider it a form of criminal negligence on the part of leaders. If they know about this danger and they refuse to act on it, they turn their heads. It's more convenient to keep your nuclear weapons than it is to discuss the fact that they could destroy human existence.
Everything.
Then that's a criminal act. That would be called willful blindness. And people have to be willing to call that out. There's some point in your life where you have to decide if you're going to do something. You can say, well, geez, that really was a terrible show I heard, and I'd like to do something about it. If you just forget about it, then that's not a solution. You got to be willing to go beyond that. But it does, we've got, now, we have Twitter, we have the internet, and things can go viral. People, can get information across at lightning-like speed around the world. So there's a capacity to educate and learn that never existed before.
Okay, well, again, I just consider it a little bit dated, Professor. In other words, unfortunately, your solution depends on rational people.
Mm-hmm.
And we seem to have moved into all right, let me try another approach. I frequently talk about interesting things like aliens or life on other planets or something. And, to date, we've actually not detected the presence of any other intelligent life anywhere, despite listening really hard. Isn't it possible that life eventually is absolutely self-destructive? It would certainly account for a lack of any signals so far.
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe Carl Sagan talked about that one time, and he said that he had a theory that once a civilization became intelligent enough to create, nuclear power, that it was more likely to self-destruct, and that's the reason why we didn't, wind up communicating with many others. But, I'm not. I've listened to a National Press Club conference not too long ago, where there were quite a few like hard-bitten military guys and Air Force pilots, and we came forward with a lot of data showing their interactions with UFOs. And I'm not going to rule out a lot of possibilities that are out there. I think, but whatever it takes for us to consider ourselves a species, if it takes a disease, that threatens to wipe out humanity, or if it takes space to land and we realize we're not the only life force, well, whatever it takes, it's okay with me if we can come to the grips with the fact that the nuclear weapons that we have amount to a self-destruct mechanism for the human race.
All right. Let's go to on Skype. Hi.
Hello, Art.
Hello.
I had a quick question for Mr. Starr. What would happen if somebody were to hijack a commercial airliner and crash it into a nuclear power plant?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, I think there have been studies to show that that could cause a lot of problems. Maybe this problem is not recognized. The spent fuel pools that I mentioned, that are each reactor stores all their used fuel rods on site in like a stainless steel lined swimming pool. It's about 40 feet deep, the size of a tennis court. A lot of the buildings that house those are just like concrete block. The buildings that would house chemical. They're not a heavy duty. They're not built to the same standard containment vessel. And a plane crashing into that could easily cause a massive release of radioactivity if it destroyed the cooling system on the pool, or breached the pool and allowed the cooling water to be released.
Okay, well, I understood Fukushima. What really was their undoing was the fact that the diesel generators that had to be maintained, and they did have them, were around. And so, of course, they flooded.
Mm-hmm.
So no power. Now,
that's right. Well, and there's another thing, too. You can burn a nuclear power plant and shut down the fission, but there's still an enormous amount of heat that's still there that's going to, you have to keep cooling the core. When they lost all the off-site power, too, and their cooling systems that were, flooded, they lost the ability to cool the reactor core. They melted. And honestly, the Japanese knew damn well that all of those reactors melted down within the first couple of days. They actually watched a lot of radioactivity travel over Japan, over Tokyo, and they didn't warn anybody. They were enemy when they were in the United States, and didn't warn people, not to drink the milk and all that. So, yeah, sorry, I would get on a little bit over there, but it still makes me mad whenever I see those sort of things happening.
I remember back in the 80s, I worked for a large station in Las Vegas, KWN, and I would have to go around, and people in precarious positions, and, washers and all those kinds of people, please be aware that 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it was, there's going to be detonation at the site. And sure enough, we would rock back and forth,
Underground tests actually vent and
release
huge amounts of radioactivity. The cancer rates there in Utah were just astronomical.
Unfortunately for us, unfortunately for Utah, that's the direction it went. Glenn on Skype, you're on the air.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
We say that hypothetically for say, city bus through the past, what about things like dial field bombs or depleted munitions. Many ways to mess things up, but especially the dial neutron tactical nuclear weapons. What do you think about that? Have we seen them used even, perhaps?
Well, the variable yield or dial yield weapons, those would be like the B-61 weapons that we have a couple hundred, I think 180 of those deployed over in Europe now at 6 or 7 different NATO bases. I don't know if I'm not aware that any have actually been used, but keep in mind that there's a difference when you talk about a nuclear detonation. It means like on a cigar, fission and airball, and that's different than a dirty bomb. Is a conventional bomb that spreads, that blows radioactive substance apart and contaminated area. The DU weapons they're a radiological weapon, depleted uranium. They don't have a nuclear detonation. They fire them about up to 70% of the round actually burns when it strikes a target, and it releases microparticles of uranium that can be inhaled and ingested very easily. So all these weapons are, the radioactivity, I think, is a really vicious kind of problem to leave in an environment, and I think it really should be considered a criminal. It should be banned. Certainly, it shouldn't be using DU weapons.
Okay, Professor Raymond sends the following by computer. Art, if nuclear wars are not cycled out after so many years, the danger is they can have electronic malfunctions, and that includes the final guidance in the MERV warheads, non-detonation and early detonation. The Demon Core went critical.
Well, they have a schedule where they refurbish plutonium bits. The plutonium itself is considered to be stable for like about a century or so. But Pantex, they take weapons apart and they will refurbish. There's a schedule for that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the United States has spent enough money to maintain its weapons that there's really very little doubt about. There may be some questions at some point about what the total yield would be if it's going to be as accurate or quite as precise as they would like, but there's no doubt that they'll work.
Okay, let's go to Mount Pleasant. Hello.
Yes, Art.
Yes.
Yeah, this is Wade in Tennessee, and I don't believe you want call signs on there, but I am a ham, and I've got a question for you and Steve.
Every shit I ever smoked.